Hi everyone, thanks for coming. So I finished my PhD about a year and a half ago, and I spent about a year of fieldwork in Congo and Uganda, studying the rebel group, which I'm going to be talking about, the Allied Democratic Forces. So my PhD research basically looked at the historical and present-day factors that have been behind the cross-border spread and regionalization of conflict in the Great Lakes region. This is Central Africa. The Great Lakes region is usually thought of as consisting of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I'm just going to be referring to as Congo in this presentation, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, sometimes Kenya gets included. So looking at the whole Great Lakes region is obviously a big undertaking, and so my fieldwork and what I'll be talking about here, I really narrowed down to specifically the Congo and Uganda border. So I looked at the North Kivu district of Congo and the Kasese, Bundabujo, and Kabarole districts of Uganda. So this is really the border that I was narrowing in on for Congo and Uganda. And as a lens through which to kind of examine this borderland and its role in the wider Great Lakes region conflict, I chose to look at one rebel group in particular, which is called the Allied Democratic Forces, or the ADF, as I'm going to be referring to it. I should also note here that Congo was engulfed in a huge regionalized conflict from about 1996 until 2003. From 2003 onwards, Congo has been officially classified as a post-conflict state. This despite the fact that there are, right now, I think over 50 rebel groups currently active in Congo, many of them from neighboring countries. So as I think my presentation will shed some light on, to classify Congo as a post-conflict state is a bit of a stretch of the imagination. And so while my presentation is in many ways actually focused on somewhat of a quite active conflict right now, I think there's still insights to be gleaned for wider issues relevant to the study of post-conflict reconstruction as well. So the ADF, the rebel group I looked at, it came onto the scene in the mid-1990s. And it was originally established in western Uganda, but it eventually came to situate itself principally on the other side of the border in the Congo. Today, as I said, it's based in the North Kivu province of Congo, but it still very much strategically uses western Uganda for various purposes as well. So really, this whole borderland remains pivotal to its operations in many senses. So the ADF has resulted in severe destabilization in western Uganda and eastern Congo. And so it's really been a pretty, I would say, lethal force kind of in this wider Great Lakes region conflict. So its numbers have dropped over the years. It was originally about 4,000 to 5,000 rebels. Today it's about 2,000. But the group is by no means even close to being eradicated. And in fact, over the past year, it's become extremely active, and I think it's really kind of on the upward swing. So the force currently is estimated to make up approximately 50-50 of Ugandan and Congolese members, with again a pretty even split between those who are abducted into the force and those who are willingly join. And every few years, it's associated with, refugee flows in the tens of thousands, and it's really proven to be one of the most stubborn obstacles to the Congo government's attempt at consolidating power over its territory. So despite that now it's existed for, almost a couple decades, very little is known about this group. And we find that most existing analyses are really I would say, have a lot of kind of mischaracterizations and inaccuracies. So the idea of the ADF as an Islamist rebel group has been really the most influential and enduring narrative of the group. And this has clearly been shaped by the global discourse on terrorism, and it's received a lot of encouragement from the Ugandan government, which is very keen on kind of playing up rebel groups' ties to terrorism in order to get funding from the US government. But what I found is that this almost exclusive focus on the Islamist angle of the ADF has meant that other important strands of the group have been sidelined in analyses. So they're nearly always understood through this kind of decontextualized lens of terrorism. So I argued in my thesis that while there is indeed an important Islamic element to the ADF, so for example, an original faction of the group were Islamic extremists from Kampala. It uses this Islamic dimension to attract funding from various groups in the Middle East. And some of the ADF's camps have been known to encourage conversion to Islam, but by no means have all of them. So despite that there definitely is this Islamic factor to the group, I argued that the group's location in and its interaction with the borderland was nevertheless really crucial for its resilience. And I would say that it's pretty impossible to adequately explain why it's been able to survive in such a kind of harsh context without consideration of this borderland context. So I want to just briefly go through some of the socio-political and then military economic kind of dimensions of the group, which help to kind of highlight how it's been able to survive in this area. So in terms of the social and political dimensions of the group, so first, a border in many ways can represent not only partition, but also opportunity for different societal forces to come into contact and interact with each other. So there are numerous documented cases of borderland populations coming together to adopt a kind of Creole culture, independent from or even in opposition to their respective national cultures. Feeding into this is a remoteness often from centralized control, and this is something that can be felt not just in a physical sense, but in a sort of administrative and political one as well. And a sense of sort of being different from their fellow citizens frequently leads to interests and visions that are fundamentally at odds with those of the capital. So these factors combined in certain borderlands can generate an important degree of volatility in these spaces. And the Ugandan Congolese borderland was very much characterized by these factors. And this environment is something that very much shaped the character of the ADF. So the groups living immediately on either side of the border, on either side of the Congo-Uganda border, proclaim an identity much more in tune to each other than to their respective nations. And this has been reinforced and strengthened by feelings of structural oppression and neglect from their governments. And over the years, memories and feelings of injustice have inspired secessionist rebellions and calls for uniting the ethnic groups on either side of the border. So ultimately, a variety of rebel groups have really been able to mobilize by building on these sentiments and animosity towards their government. And this includes the ADF, which really came out of the remnants of several of these movements. So the vulnerability of the borderlanders in terms of their development status, in terms of their economic condition, but I would say mostly in terms of their socio-political identity, has really been critically advantageous for the ADF. It's meant that they've been able to build off of former hostilities and the borderlanders' historical grudges against their governments. For many inhabitants of the area, the ADF has offered the opportunity to kind of seek revenge or an opportunity to rectify one of their many grievances. It's also, I think, very importantly meant that support for anti-ADF campaigns by the governments in the area and by the UN peacekeeping force have not been popular. And there's been a lot of connivance with the ADF. And so a lot of even though in many ways it's a very brutal rebel group, they would still choose to have the ADF in the area rather than their governments. So while the rebels' rhetoric has outwardly projected the image of a group fighting on behalf of aggrieved Muslims, in reality the force has been recruited from far more than just the surrounding Muslim populations. And in reality, the force is really comprised of a multitude of different groups, this Muslim faction just being one of many. And so consequently, the ADF have really harbored a variety of grievances, agendas, and aims. In terms of the military and kind of economic dimensions of the group, these have also, I would say, been pivotally shaped by the borderland. And the rebel group has been able to use and extrapolate resources from this area for their military and economic ends. In general, with borderlands, often the lack of state presence allows, kind of exceptional ease of mobility across borders for actors like warlords and militias. And the Uganda-Congo borderlands' long-standing tradition of rebel resistance against central authority, compounded kind of by this proximity to the border and the Congolese state's lack of effective control over its own territory, has really represented ideal rebel terrain in many sense. So consequently, there have always been really a variety of rebel groups operating in this area, and this is something the ADF has really used strategically for their advantage in terms of alliances or trading in weaponry and so on. Its military resilience has been influenced by an ability to use cross-border military and economic patterns pursued not only by previous rebels, but also by local civilians. So for example, the kind of cultural continuum between the ethnic groups that span both sides of the border has made it far easier for the ADF to operate between Uganda and Congo. So this kind of transnational ethnic overlap between these communities gives the ADF advantages in areas like communication, transportation, use of attack and retreat strategies. It's also really enabled them to kind of blend into surrounding target populations, scout future attack sites, and other kind of military activities like that. In terms of economics, the borderlands in general tend to have a unique environment. The presence of the border, together with generally a sense of animosity or distrust towards the central government amongst the locals, tends to breed economic independence and self-assertiveness amongst borderlanders. Not only does this often result in economic activity being directed outwards and over the border, as opposed to back towards the capital, but it also often emboldens an attitude sort of ambivalence with regards to cooperating with national customs and trade regulations. So smuggling in some form or another is usually quite a prevalent feature in these areas. And Central Africa is definitely characterized by this. So the system also tends to be supported by the local population, who not only tend to kind of remain connected to these economic practices, but they're also usually highly experienced and knowledgeable about the different kind of border regulation regimes and stuff in their area. So the ease with which activities like smuggling can be conducted in these borderlands really allows conflict actors the ability to conduct quite lucrative businesses. And this has definitely been the case with the ADF. So it's been able to very much tap into these historic cross-border trade networks. And the biggest ethnic group in the area, the Nande, who straddle the border, they make up the biggest percentage in terms of kind of ethnicities of the ADF. And this has really been crucial. So the ADF are, they're able to kind of merge with an already existing and extensive informal trading tradition through building off of their local members' economic networks, these being the Nande networks, or taking advantage of, kinship relationships with Nande traders. They're also able to integrate into the local economy of the cities in the borderland, where they have businesses, they have stores. So on a micro level as well, it's quite easy for them to operate, to get food, to get resources and supplies in general. Okay, I want to move on to the responses to borderland conflicts, and especially the response to this conflict. So I think in general, borderland conflict remains somewhat of an understudied area in academia, but I would argue that international conflict management is far further behind in this sense. There's increased recognition amongst policymakers today that conflict often does not respect territorial boundaries and that wars are increasingly marked by refugee flows, cross-border weapons networks, and regionalized war economies. But international efforts to resolve transnational conflicts, especially those of a borderland character, have continued to use conventional state-centric approaches. Part of the problem to do with this has to do with just the historic neglect of borderlands and a long-established tradition, I'd say, of viewing these spaces as marginal backwaters of a country. Compounding this neglect of borderlands is the ingrained structure of conflict management responses. So conflict management actors tend to pursue strategies organized around national political boundaries. So while they may recognize the role of transnational actors, they tend to do this somewhat superficially. Their strategies, for example, rarely transcend the level of an individual country. Rarely do we ever see a peacekeeping operation that will have a mandate in 2 countries, for example. In essence, they usually target problems through the realm of the state rather than the conflict system. The most obvious problems that arise from this are what are known as edge effects. And this is basically the phenomena of policies that fall short of seeing the borderland kind of as an integrated whole. So this would include policies that apply to one side of the border in a transnational conflict, right? So the other side of the border is completely kind of disregarded. So the edge effects brought on by inadequate strategies, for example, in DDR practices and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration strategies, have been very common, often in a transnational conflict. The war economy of just kind of one side of the border will be addressed, with the other side, which is just as crucial, really being ignored. And conflict management efforts with respect to the ADF rebellion have very much been characterized by these practices. So for one thing, the overwhelming focus on the Islamic angle of the group has really dictated the shape of the international response. As I tried to show before, the ADF is really this multifaceted actor with a whole variety of dimensions, some of which are very bound up with these borderland dynamics. But this diversity of the group has really gone unrecognized, not only by analysts, but also by the UN peacekeeping mission in the area, which is known as MONUSCO. Only one strand essentially has been picked up, the extremist Muslim one, and this has tended to really be the only element that's been acted upon. So in terms of recruitment, for example, there have been almost no considerations of the role of borderland grievances, and there's been an almost exclusive focus on attempting to monitor and stop Islamist recruitment networks, which really only make up a tiny proportion of the group. Likewise, for the UN's approach to how the ADF acquires material resources. So the focus has been entirely on external Islamic sources of funding and supplies, while the borderland, material lifeline has been disregarded. And with regards to their practice of violence, the Islamic focus has really steered conflict management personnel to viewing the ADF's actions through the lens of jihad and other extremist terrorist motivations, rather than looking at the far more common occurrences of violence in the borderland. So the focus has really been on trying to prevent terrorist attacks by the ADF in urban centers. The likelihood of that is extremely small. And what they're really ignoring is the violence that is taking place every day in the borderland, rural areas. Not only has the perception of the ADF as a completely Islamist rebel group shaped responses, but a perception of them as Ugandan, as a Ugandan group, has as well. Their connection to the Congo has been understood mostly just in terms of kind of territory, that this is a group that just uses Congolese territory. And this has really shaped how MONUSCO has tried to respond to the group. So the ADF are understood to be just yet another foreign force on Congolese soil that needs to be dissolved or expelled, not really recognizing how integrated they are with the Congo as well. So what should international responses to the ADF look like? Well, there are obviously some serious problems with this interpretation of the ADF, and they've negatively affected international attempts to respond to the rebellion. So I'd say the first is that these rebels do not represent a Ugandan or foreign group. Of course, neither are they strictly a Congolese group. They're fundamentally transnational. And because they're so deeply politically, socially, and economically embedded in this kind of micro-region, military action against them so far has been completely ineffective. Their ties and networks to the borderland are simply too strong for them to be allowed to simply be, thrown out of this area. So their ability to move to the other side of the border in times of military strikes against them, all of these kinds of things make military action against them pretty unfeasible. And the other thing is there have been attempted DDR strategies to get the group to disband and demobilize, with the idea that they should be returning home to Uganda. But for a lot of the force, that doesn't make any sense. So I would say that a step towards a more effective response would be appreciating the very substantive differences in origin and in shape and motives of the various rebel groups operating in this area, rather than kind of always conceptually lumping them together. And so the ADF bears very little commonality to groups like the FDLR or the LRA, which many of you might have heard of. But they often kind of get treated in terms of conflict management as the same. So being a borderland group, the ADF have very particular modes of recruiting, of acquiring material resources, of executing their violence. And in many ways, they're really a reflection of the conditions of the borderland. Of course, they contribute to its militarization, but they're also very much a product of its ills, its negative characteristics. So what needs to be addressed, I think, are the deeper structural problems of the borderland. So the governance shortfalls and the political marginalization of these communities, the transnational networks of unemployed young men or young men who've gone through the DDR process but not found any jobs, the economic cross-border systems that have really come to resolve solely around war economies. So the networks of the borderland, I would say, really need to be kind of reclaimed and ultimately reoriented towards far more peaceful purposes. And borders and borderlands really have to get transformed from these spaces of insecurity to spaces of security. And I think all of these kinds of measures have been somewhat ignored in the conflict management and the post-conflict responses. So in the end, I think a scenario where the ADF is, removed from the borderland, but the structural problems of this space are left unaddressed, this will accomplish very little. As the history of this borderland has really shown, eventually another group will just come and simply fill the void. So I'm going to leave it at that. I forgot to kind of explain the pictures as I went. This is the MONUSCO peacekeeping operation. This was when an arms cache from the ADF was discovered. And this is the actual border. This is you can see how really kind of rural it is. But that's the border. That's the road leading up to the border on the Congo side. And this is a picture of the ADF. So I will leave it there. Thanks.